This video is over Lesson 85, Order of Operations with Positive and Negative Numbers, and it is for my 7th grade math class. Because addition and subtraction are the weakest operations, they are the operations that happen last and that separate terms. This gives us a shortcut when doing order of operations problems. We can do something from each term in the problem in each step. Then, when all the terms are simplified, we add and subtract from left to right. It will be helpful to think of the minus sign as making the following term negative. So, we're going to do a few examples like this. And to start off, quick review. So, if we are adding two numbers, and if the numbers have the same sign, then the operation that we're actually going to do is addition. We will actually add the numbers. So if it's a positive plus a positive or a negative plus a negative, we will actually add those together. The sign will be the same sign. So if they're both positive, the answer will be a positive. If they're both negative, the answer will be a negative. Now if we're adding, and if the numbers have different signs, so one's a positive and one's a negative, then the operation that we're actually going to do is subtraction. And the sign will be the same as the bigger number. So if they have a different sign, we will subtract those two numbers. If the bigger number is positive, the answer will be positive. If the bigger number is negative, the answer will be negative. When it comes to subtraction, as we've been saying recently, we want to think of the minus as being a negative. And then there's a very important phrase that you need to memorize. Minus a negative is the same as plus a positive. In fact, that's so important that I want you to grab your yellow highlighter, please, and highlight that statement. So anytime we come across minus a negative, the minus and the negative, since they're happening to the same term, will cancel each other out and will become plus a positive. Okay, but they got to be right in a row, minus negative, right in a row. For multiplication, it actually doesn't matter if the sign is the same or if it's different. For multiplication, either way we're going to multiply. There's no difference there. You're going to multiply no matter what for multiplication. The difference comes in the sign. So if the numbers have the same sign, so if they're both positive or they're both negative, well, if they're both positive, obviously it'll be a positive. If they're both negative, remember that the two negatives being part of the same term will cancel each other out. So that will end up being a positive either way. Oop. Sorry, sometimes I like to combine my I's with my V's. There we go. So if they're both positive or they're both negative, the answer will be a positive. On the other hand, if they have different signs, so one of them is positive, one of them is negative, then there won't be anything there to cancel that negative out, meaning it will tag along to our answer, making our answer a negative. Division, as it turns out, well, it's related to multiplication, so it actually follows the exact same rule, that when it comes to division, no matter what, we're going to divide. If they have the same sign, it will be positive. If they have different signs, it will be negative. So those are the rules. You need to have this memorized. Okay, get comfortable with this. Look at it as many times as you need to as you're working on your homework until you have it memorized. So we're going to take a look at the practice problems from the book now. And that is on page 589, 589. So for order of operations, remember that order of operations is with us all the time. If you have more than one operation in a problem, you must follow the order of operations. So order of operations, we symbolize that with the nonsense word PEMDAS. Or some classes may say, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or there's a few others. But in my class, I like PEMDAS. So remember that multiplication and division are really just one step because they're the same thing. They just work in opposite ways. Addition and subtraction are really the same step, same thing. They just work in opposite ways. So parentheses, then exponents, then multiplication, division, then addition, subtraction. Quick word of caution here. A lot of times when we're working with negatives, we may use parentheses around a negative just to make it clear that what's in front of that is a negative sign and not a minus sign. And so we have to kind of differentiate a little bit, because if there's nothing to do inside of the parentheses, then they don't count as parentheses. So with that being said, let's take a look at problem A. Now, one of the things that I'm going to recommend here is that we get rid of some of these unnecessary parentheses, and that we also get rid of some of the unnecessary positive signs. So my first number there, I see parentheses, -3. Well, I can just write that as -3. And then after that is a plus sign. And then in parentheses, I have another -3 followed by another -3 in parentheses. This time, it might be helpful to keep those just to make it clear that this is a negative, but that's a plus. So I got a -3 times a -3, and then minus, and then a fraction. Now inside the fraction, I really don't need those parentheses. I could just have my -3 up top and write a plain old 3, +3 on bottom. So that's actually how I would probably copy letter A. Now from here, remember what we just talked about in the paragraph up above, that we can do something from each term as we go along. So we're learning some shortcuts here to our PEMDAS. Now within each term, we still need to follow the order. So if there are anything in parentheses in the term, got to do those first, then exponents, then we get to the multiplication division. Remember that addition and subtraction separates terms. So my first term here is just this -3. Well, nothing to do there, so I'm just going to copy them down. Plus is going to separate that from the next term. The next term here, all I see is a -3 times a -3, and then a minus. So that's my second term, -3 times -3. So that's multiplication, where the signs are the same. So we are going to multiply those together. 3 times 3 is 9. And since it's the same, they have the same sign, they're both negative, it'll be a +9 for the answer. Now I'm going to have my minus here. And then I've got fractions. This fraction is my last term. So fractions mean division. So I'm dividing, but this is a negative and that's a positive. So I'm dividing, but they have different signs. So therefore we are going to divide, but the answer is going to be a negative. So 3 divided by 3 is 1, and then it'll be a -1. So I'm going to put that -1 in parentheses just to make it clear that that's my minus, that's my negative. Now here's where that statement we highlighted comes in handy. That anytime we see minus a negative, so right here I have minus a negative, we can change this into plus a positive. So I can go right like this, plus, positive. And we are going to leave that positive symbol in there for right now. We can drop it later if we want to, but I'm going to leave it in for now. So that way when I look back at this and I see, oh, why did I have that positive sign? Ah, it must have been minus a negative to start with. And we change it to plus a positive. So now let's go ahead. We've simplified all the terms. Now we need to add the terms together. So a -3 plus a +9. So I'm adding. They have different signs. So the operation I'm going to do is I'm actually going to subtract. So 9 minus 3 is 6. But then its sign will be the same as the bigger number. Well, the +9 is the bigger, so that'll make it a +6. So this is a +6 plus, well, that's just a +1. So it comes down to really just 6 plus 1. 6 plus 1 is 7. and that's letter A. So moving on to letter B. Letter B, out front I see the parentheses and then a -3, so that's really a -3. So I'm going to drop the parentheses, just make that a -3. Minus, and now there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. So when I look at this, what I see first is I see a bracket and then a parenthesis, -4, close parentheses. So that's really just a -4 in the bracket, minus, okay, and then I see in parentheses a -5, and then in parentheses a -6, and then the closing bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the bracket in. We're going to need that because that bracket is going to count as a parenthesis in the order of operation. Now, inside the bracket, that -4 doesn't really need to be in parentheses anymore. And then minus, and because I've got that -5 there, I'm going to put the parentheses around the -5 still. And then it's being multiplied with -6, just like we have the -3 times -3. We got a -5 times -6, and then I close the bracket. And so hopefully that's a little bit easier to read than what the book has. And so now we got to work it through. So order of operations tells me I got to do stuff in parentheses first. So parentheses first. So technically, actually, this all counts as one term. So the -3 would be my first term, and then everything inside of here would technically be my second term. However, just to talk about this in ways that are actually helpful, if we look inside of this, there are terms inside of this term. So inside of the brackets, I have two terms. My first term is a -4, nothing to simplify there. So I'm going to keep my bracket, keep my -4. However, minus this term here that's connected by multiplication, we can simplify. So a -5 times a -6. So, well, -5 times -6, they're multiplying with the same sign. So multiply, and it's positive. So 5 times 6 is 30, and that'll be a positive 30. And close the bracket. Now just following the order of operations, obviously I got to do that before I can do -3 minus it. So I'm going to do -3 there, minus, just copy those down. And then over here, I've got a -4 minus 30. Now remember, we've said this a few times now. Think of the minus as being a negative. So what's really happening here is we have a -4 and a -30. So if you imagine making those arrows on a number line, -4 would be going 4 to the left, and then -30 or -30 would be like going 30 more to the left. So where do you end up with if you go 4 to the left and then 30 more to the left? Well, -34. Since it's a minus here, I'm going to put that -34 in parentheses just to make it clear what's my minus sign, what's my negative sign. Aha! Once again, we've got minus and negative. You see them right there in a row. Minus, negative. So that means I can change this into plus and positive. So to finish this off, I've got a -3 plus a positive 34. So -3 would be like 3 to the left. Positive 34 would be like coming 34 to the right. Well, if you are back at -3 and you go 3 to the right, that'll put you at 0. But then I got to go 31 more to the right. Or, if we follow the rules, I'm adding, but they have different signs, so we subtract, and the sign is the same as the bigger number. So 34 minus 3 is 31, and this is a positive, so that's a positive. Either way you want to look at it. I'm going to split this up into 2 columns and take a look at C now. So when I look at C, again, I see a bunch of parentheses. I see parentheses around the -2. I see parentheses around the -3, parentheses around -4 and -5. But then I also see those brackets. And the brackets are grouping things together, saying, all right, here's your order of operations. So technically in this problem, there's only one term because you got a bunch of stuff stuck in the brackets, and then times -2, which would connect it all as one term. Now looking at it that way, though, isn't really helpful for solving, though. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy the -2 as -2 since it's in the front. It doesn't really need parentheses. And then in the bracket, I'm going to look at which ones do I need. So that first negative 3, I don't really need it in parentheses, so I'm going to drop that. That's one less thing to write. Now, since we're multiplying the negative 4 and the negative 5, and there's a minus sign out in front of them, I am going to keep those in parentheses just to make it clear. 5. Just to make it clear that those are negative signs. So there's letter C. So again, technically this is all one term, not very helpful though. So like we did in the last problem, if we look though inside of the brackets, we see terms inside of terms. And here I've got two terms. I've got the negative 3 where there's nothing to simplify, and I've got the negative 4 times negative 5 that we can simplify. So negative 2 bracket negative 3 minus, now negative 4 times negative 5, so multiplication with the same sign. So we are going to multiply and it'll be a positive. The two negatives will cancel each other. So negative 4 times negative 5 would be a positive 20. Now, order of operations, I'm going to do these parentheses. I'm going to keep finishing that up. So the negative 2 gets copied, and then I'm just going to put this in parentheses just to be safe. So use that for my multiplication. So changing the brackets to parentheses, not a big deal. So inside I see a negative 3 and then a minus 20. Remember, we're going to treat that like a negative. So this is like negative 3 and then negative 20. So that means that we are adding a negative 3 with a negative 20. So if we treat that like addition, so we're adding, they have the same sign, so it means we really are going to add those together. So 3 plus 20 is 23, and then they're going to have the same sign as whatever they both have. So they're both negative, so it'll be a negative 23. So it's a good thing I decided to keep those parentheses, because those parentheses make it real clear that this is a negative, not a minus. And now I just got to finish it off. So since we're multiplying, and they're both negative, so we're multiplying with the same sign, so we are going to multiply, but the two negatives will cancel and it'll be a positive for the answer. So 2 times 23 is 46, and that'll be a positive 46. If we look at D, I have a negative 5 out front, so I can just write that as negative 5, minus, and then since I've got a negative 5 times negative 5 there, it can be good to leave those in parentheses, just so we're clear that those are negatives, not minuses. And then I have a plus, and then the absolute value of negative 5. So notice the absolute value is straight up and down. It goes a little bit above and below the blue lines, just a little bit. So that way we don't mistake it with ones. All right, let's tackle this now. So one thing in each term. I've got 3 terms this time. I've got the negative 5. I've got the negative 5 times negative 5. And then separated with a plus, I've got the absolute value. So remember, the minus and pluses separate the terms. So 3 terms. I got a negative 5 still. Now if we simplify this term, a negative 5 times a negative 5, so multiplication, same sign. So multiply them, but the two negatives will cancel and make it a positive answer. So 5 times 5 is 25, and the two negatives cancel, so positive 25 there. Plus, and then remember that absolute value is asking us the question, how far away is this from 0? What's the distance from 0? So if you think about a number line, where would negative 5 be from 0? How many spaces away? It'd be 5 spaces away. And now if we go ahead and put this together, I'm going to think my minus like a negative. So this is like a negative 25. So I have negative 5 plus a negative 25. So I think about that as addition. They've got the same sign. They're both negatives. So we are going to add them and keep the sign. So 5 plus 25 is 30. And since they're both negative, it'll be a negative 30. And then finally, we're going to add these up. So I got a negative and a positive. Well, this is addition with different signs. So we are actually going to subtract them, and the bigger guy wins. So 30 minus 5 is 25, but the big guy was the negative. So it'll be a negative 25. I'm going to have to go to the back now for E. So E, they write negative 3 plus 4 minus 5 minus 2. So in this case, remember that the pluses and the minus separate this into terms. So we have one term separated, two terms separated, three terms separated, four terms. Four terms, and we can treat all the minuses like negatives. So this is a negative 3, this is a positive 4, this is a negative 5, and that's a negative 2. So one of the things that can be helpful here is, in a problem like this, is if you combine all the negatives and all the positives. So if we combine all the negatives, then we're going to add them up and keep them negative. So a negative 3 plus a negative 5 would be a negative 8, plus a negative 2 would be a negative 10. So this is really a negative 10 plus 4. And now since these have different signs, that's a negative, that's a positive, we know we're going to subtract them. So 10 minus 4 is 6, and the big guy wins. Well, the big guy's there is negative. So that's one way you could do that. Nice little shortcut there. Now you could also just follow the rules and go a little slower. So a negative 3 and a positive 4, a negative 3 and a positive 4, different signs, so we're going to subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1, and since the bigger one's positive, it'll stay positive. Copy down the minus 5 and the minus 2. Well then, 1 and a negative 5 have different signs, so we're going to subtract. 5 minus 1 is 4, but since the big guy is negative, that'll be a negative 4. Copy down the minus 2. And then a negative 4 and a negative 2 have the same sign, so we would actually add those. 4 plus 2 is 6, and keep that negative sign. So either way it works. So you can just combine all your negatives and combine all your positives and then add them up, or you could take it just step by step by step. We take a look at F. F, I've got a negative 2 plus 3 times negative 4 minus 5 times negative 2. So if we look for our terms, I've got a term separated, second term separated, third term. So 3 terms here. Let's simplify each one. So negative 2 has nothing to simplify. 3 times a negative 4 would actually be a, well, 3 times 4 is 12, but then remember the negative is going to tag along, making that a negative 12, and I'm going to use the parentheses just to make that clear, that that's a negative. And then minus, and then 5 times 2 is 10, and the negative will tag along, that'll be a negative 10. Well, ladies and gentlemen, remember anytime we see minus a negative, we can change that to plus a positive. Not only can we should. So let's start putting this together. A negative 2 plus a negative 12, same sign, so we're going to add those up. That'll be a 14, and we're going to keep it negative. And now it's really just plus 10. So different signs means we'll subtract. 14 minus 10 is 4, but the big guy is a negative, so negative 4. G, we have a negative 3 times a negative 2 minus 5 times 2 plus 3 times negative 4. So again, if we look for those plus and minuses, those would separate the terms. So this is one term separated, 2 terms separated, 3 terms. So do one thing in each term. Well, here, the one thing I can do is negative 3 times negative 2. Well, 3 times 2 is 6, but those two negatives will cancel each other out because they're part of the same term. So it's just a positive 6. Minus, well, 5 times 2, that's easy. 5 times 2 is 10. Plus 3 times negative 4. Well, 3 times 4 is 12, but the negative will tag along, making that a negative 12. So if we go ahead and we do this, we can do 6 minus 10. Well, 6 to the right and 10 to the left is a negative 4, plus a negative 12. And then since they have the same sign, we're going to go ahead and really add them. So 4 plus 12 is 16, and we keep the negative. I want to do this one more time. So another way to tackle this one would be to go ahead and say negative 3 times negative 2 is a positive 6, minus 5 times 2 is 10, and then 3 times negative 4 is negative 12, and instead of writing that as a plus and a negative, we could just write that as a minus 12. So plus negative 12 really is the same as minus 12, because remember, we think about that minus as making that a negative 12. So that is an option right there. So from there, 6 minus 10, so that's like positive 6 and negative 10, gives me a negative 4 minus 12. And then a negative 4 and a negative 12 gives me a negative 16. So same result, just slightly different way of writing it. H. H is a negative 4 times a negative 3 times a negative 2, and then minus 6, didn't need the parentheses just yet, 6 times a negative 4. So first up, I have a term separated a second term. So over here, this is all multiplication in this term. We can just go ahead and do the whole thing then, since it's all multiplication. So 4 times 3 is 12, times 2 is 24. And remember that pairs of negatives will cancel. So this pair of negatives could cancel, but then I'd have a negative left over to make my answer a negative. Minus, and then 6 times negative 4, well, there's nothing to cancel out that negative, so it'll be a negative 24. Remember that anytime we see minus a negative, we want to change that to plus a positive. So now, if you think about going 24 steps to the left, and then coming back 24 steps to the right, where are you going to be at? Well, 0. If we add opposites, we get 0. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our lesson.